Hello, in this video I'm going to be giving a counter-argument to the growing theory that we can't reopen our country because there might be a second wave. Most arguments in support of this theory base their argument off the 1918 flu, which they claimed killed many more people in the second wave than the first. I'm going to show you evidence which will suggest that the entire premise of the 1918 flu is wrong, therefore making the second wave theory a lot less valid, as most people supporting this theory use the 1918 flu as an example of a second wave virus. To start off, let's talk about the people most affected by the 1918 flu. The 1918 flu affected adults between the ages of 20 and 40. Whereas flu today mostly affects the elderly and young children. Furthermore, contemporary sources indicate that the symptoms of this epidemic bore very little resemblance to the usual symptoms of flu. An article named The Influenza Pandemic of 1918 on the Stanford University website writes about some of the symptoms reported by physicians at the time. Others told stories of people on their way to work suddenly developing the flu and dying within hours. One physician writes that patients with seemingly ordinary influenza would rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that had ever been seen. Later, when cyanosis appeared in the patients, it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. Another physician recalls that the influenza patients died struggling to clear their airways of a blood-tinged froth that sometimes gushed from their nose and mouth. The physicians of the time were helpless against this powerful agent of influenza. This was clearly not like flu today, or what the modern medical establishment says is the flu. This straight away should be firing some red flags about the 1918 flu. I would like to point out that labelling the 1918 flu as 1918 is misleading, as there is evidence that indicates serious health problems existing over the years as early as 1915 and continuing until the late 1920s. One of the anomalies from the mainstream reports about the 1918 flu is the wide variation in the mortality statistics that are reported. Some claim that 20 to 40 million died, others 50, and some 100. This large margin in data shows a lack of reliable original data to support the mortality claimed to have been caused solely by a flu. Another group affected a lot by the flu was military personnel, yet they are supposed to be the fittest and healthiest group within the population. After all, their fitness levels could be the difference between losing or winning a battle. However, some reports indicate that soldiers were among the most severely affected by the flu. For example, a 2014 article named Death from 1918 Pandemic Influenza During the First World War states that pandemic influenza struck all the armies, but the highest morbidity rate was found amongst the American, as the disease sickened 26% of the US Army, over 1 million men. The article also reports that the German Army recorded over 700,000 cases of influenza. This article shows that the flu affected all parties in the conflict. This raises the question about the origin of the flu and how a virus could be transmitted between soldiers on opposing sides of the war, especially within trench warfare where opposing countries' soldiers are far apart from one another. This questioning has led to attempts to trace the source of this so-called flu. These efforts have uncovered some information which will be useful for an investigation into the real causes. For example, the 2014 article cited before refers to conditions in the trenches and states, "The origin of the influenza pandemic has been inextricably linked with the men who occupied the military camps and trenches during the First World War." One of the contributory factors for poor health suffered by the troops is vaccination. All soldiers received a number of vaccinations against a variety of diseases they were thought to encounter. These include rabies, typhoid fever, diphtheria, and smallpox. Another contributory factor was the medicines with which the ill and wounded were treated with. The author Aniela McBean refers to the 1918 flu in swine flu exposure and states that it was a common expression during the war that more soldiers were killed by vaccine shots than by shots from enemy guns. The vaccines, in addition to the poison drugs given in the hospitals, made healing impossible in too many cases. If the men had not been young and healthy to begin with, they would all have succumbed to the mass poisoning in the army. The medicine commonly prescribed at the time for the treatment of flu during the early 20th century was aspirin, the dangers of which was unknown at the time, but its dangers have since been recognised, and aspirin has been shown to cause respiratory problems, as indicated by a November 2009 article entitled Salicylates and Pandemic Influenza Mortality, 1918 to 1919, Pharmacology and Pathology and Historic Evidence, that states pharmacokinetic data, which were unavailable in 1918, indicate that the aspirin regimens recommended for the Spanish influenza predisposed to severe pulmonary toxicity. The article refers to pathology findings reported during 1918 and states they are consistent with aspirin toxicity. The symptoms described by the previously shown Stanford University article are strikingly similar to the symptoms that are recognized to result from high intake of aspirin. One of the consequences of the war was the need for constant supply of fresh meat.
Fresh meat for the grinder, eh?
This need for additional troops meant that entry requirements for administration to the military was by necessity lowered. This meant that new recruits were not necessarily as fit and healthy as the ones they were replacing, and therefore more vulnerable to the effects of vaccines, medication, and the appalling conditions they had to endure. A 2010 article named The State of Science, Microbiology and Vaccines, circa 1918, explains the uncertain nature of early vaccine trials during World War I. Many vaccines were developed and used during the 1918-1919 pandemic. The medical literature was full of contradictory claims of their success. There was apparently no consensus on how to judge the reported results of these vaccine trials. Another article in 2009 called The Fog of Research, Influenza Vaccine Trials During the 1918 Pandemic, which states that bacterial vaccines of various sorts were widely used for both preventative and therapeutic purposes during the great influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919. Some of were derived exclusively from Pifias bacillus, the presumed cause of influenza, while others contained one or more other organisms found in the lungs of victims. Although initially most reports of the use of these vaccines claimed they prevented influenza or pneumonia, the results were inconsistent and sometimes contradictory. The vaccines were clearly recognized to have been of problematic efficiency, yet the underlying theory that the cause was a bacterium was not questioned. The idea that the disease was infectious also remained unquestioned. According to some contemporary reports, there were many cases of typhoid fever within the military. However, this was one of the diseases that the soldiers were vaccinated against. It would therefore be extremely inconvenient for the medical establishment, and especially the vaccine industry, if soldiers were reported to be suffering from a disease which they had been vaccinated against. It is not unreasonable then to assume that certain illnesses were reclassified as influenza to protect the medical establishment interests. The practice of renaming conditions is not an uncommon one for the medical establishment. An example of this would be the reclassification of polio as AFP, so they can say that they eradicated polio when in fact they just reclassified it. Ow, my head. Stay still. I gotta wrap this bandage around your head. Hey, I'm a physician. Don't worry, I've just been dealing with some flu patients. Flu patients? Well, this guy's got a piece of shrapnel in his head. You sure it's not flu? See, he just coughed. Classic symptom of flu. Look, I'm no physician, but this guy's got a literal piece of metal in his head. You can see the blood coming out. That's why I'm trying to put a band-aid on it. I don't know. Oh man, I feel really weak. Aha! Feeling of weakness and coughing? Definitely the flu. Yes, I'm going to record this as a case of flu. You dumbass mother. Sleepy sickness is more often called sleepy sickness to differentiate it from African sleeping sickness or typhanomosis. However, sleepy sickness has another name. It is called lethargic encephalitis, which is claimed to be the result of a viral or bacterial infection. It was reported that an epidemic of LE occurred during the period between 1916 and 1930. This was a singular event. LE had never been previously erupted as an epidemic, nor has it ever done so since that time, although it is still claimed to exist. It is significant that this epidemic of LE is synchronous with the epidemic of influenza. Dr. Bregan MD refers to LE in his 2008 article named Parallels Between Neuroleptic Effects and Lethargic Encephalitis and states, LE was identified by von Economo in the winter of 1916 to 1917 in Vienna. The pandemic was most severe in Europe and North America, with cases reported throughout the world. Over a decade, the disease afflicted more than 1 million people and caused hundreds of thousands of fatalities. The last epidemic was reported in 1926, and the disease largely disappeared by 1930. The infectious nature of LE was demonstrated with its transmission to monkeys, but the presumed viral agent was never isolated or identified. Chlorpromase was one of the first neuroleptic drugs. It was developed in the 1950s and is still in use. The trade name is Thorazine. In toxic psychiatry, Dr. Bragan refers to Delay and Denker, two French physicians who were among the first to use chlorpromazine to treat their patients. Dr. Bragan says that they immediately noticed that small dosages produced a neurological disease very similar to a special type of violet flu virus that killed tens of thousands during and shortly after the First World War. Although he refers to a flu virus, his reference to a neurological disease is highly significant. He adds that the type of flu mimicked by the drugs was called LE. Dr. Bragan's 2008 article expands on the similarity between the effects of neuroleptic drugs and the symptoms of LE. Neuroleptic drugs are also known as antipsychotic drugs and are used for patients diagnosed with some psychiatric disorders, especially schizophrenia. The epidemic of LE was not caused by neuroleptic drugs. However, it is clear that certain pharmaceuticals are capable of inducing a neurological disease, which means that their ingredients must be neurotoxic. There is also evidence that 20th century vaccines could produce LE, as recorded by Annie Riley Haley in her book named The Medical Voodoo. In the book Journal of Experimental Pathology, August 1926, two well-known London medical professors, Doctors Turnbull and McIntosh, reported several cases of epilepticus lethargica, sleeping sickness, following vaccination which had come under their observation. The post-vaccination encephalitis is a recognized phenomenon, as indicated by a September 1931 article named Post-Vaccination Encephalitis that states, post-vaccination encephalitis is a disease of unknown etiology that has appeared in recent years and which occurs without regard to the existence of known factors other than the presence of a recent vaccination against smallpox. The smallpox vaccination may not have been the only vaccine capable of causing encephalitis. As mentioned earlier, there were others available to 1918. The article makes a further interesting comment that drug manufacturers aggressively promoted their stock vaccines for colds, gripe, and flu. These vaccines were of undisclosed composition. More evidence to support the theory that vaccinations were contributory factors to the illness labelled as 1918 flu is provided by Virus Mania, in which the author says that a frequently observed symptom of the Spanish flu was internal bleeding in the lung, typical of tuberculosis patients, for example, a phenomenon that was also described as a result of smallpox vaccinations. All vaccinations of the early 20th century contained toxic ingredients, which the article also describes. Additionally, the medications and vaccines applied in masses at the time contained highly toxic substances like heavy metals, arsenic, formaldehyde, and chloroform. Despite medicines such as aspirin and vaccinations contributing considerably, these were not the only factors relevant to the morbidity and mortality attributed to the epidemic influenza. The early 20th century was also a time in which chemical manufacture was on the rise. One chemical in particular was chlorine. In the book named Pandora's Poison, Joe Thornton explains in detail the extremely toxic nature of chlorine gas, which although a chemical element, it is not an element that occurs naturally. Joe explains in his book that in nature, chlorine is always found with a chloride salt, a substance that is stable and relatively harmless. Although in the late 18th century, a chemical experiment unexpectedly produced chlorine gas, which is highly reactive, destructive, and deadly. Joe explains in this paragraph. First recognized as an element in the early 19th century, chlorine is a heavy green-colored gas with a powerful odor. If released into the environment, chlorine gas will travel slowly over the ground in a coherent cloud, a phenomenon familiar to World War I soldiers who faced it as a chemical weapon. One of chlorine's first large-scale applications, also familiar to these men, was chlorine's toxicity, which arose from its tendency to combine with and destroy organic matter, like that of the lungs and eyes. Joe also goes on in detail to describe a number of extremely important facts about the military use of chlorine during the period of World War I. Elemental chlorine was first deployed in 1915 on the battlefields of Ypres, with horrific consequences. The chemical industry continued to experiment with chlorine and produce further weapons as the war continued, and they saw a profitable opportunity. Joe also further explains this. The military industry soon began to make other chlorine-based chemical weapons, such as phosgene and mustard gas, which made their debuts during the next 2 years at Verdun and again at Ypres. The industrial development of chlorine-based chemicals for military use was undertaken by both sides in World War I, as Joe explains. As both sides developed sophisticated means to deliver war gas in shells, grenades and other armaments, casualties of chlorine chemical weapons rose into the tens of thousands. Despite not being inherently fatal, survivors of chlorine gas attacks would have respiratory problems for the rest of their lives. Joe in detail further explains the toxicity of chlorine-based gas weapons. Chlorine chemicals were particularly effective chemical weapons because they were highly toxic and oil-soluble, so they could cross cell membranes and destroy the tissues of lungs, eyes, skin, incapacitating soldiers and causing extreme pain. These symptoms are like those described by the Stanford University article, which suggests the likelihood that cases of chlorine gassing initially had been mistakenly identified as cases of flu. Nitroglycerin was first produced prior to the 20th century, but it was reported to have been manufactured in large quantities and had been used extensively during World War I. The significance of nitroglycine is reported by Nicholas Ashford, PhD, and Dr. Clelia Miller, MD, in their 1998 book named Chemical Exposures, Low Levels and High Stakes, in which they state that nitroglycerin, used to manufacture gunpowder, rocket fuels, and dynamite, may cause severe headaches, breathing difficulties, weakness, drowsiness, nausea, and vomiting as a result of inhalation. These symptoms are remarkably similar to some of the symptoms attributed to both influenza and LE. The war effort inevitably created a substantially increased demand for the industry manufacture of machinery, equipment, and weapons, many of which needed to be welded. Welding is another hazardous occupation, as the author explains. Welding and the galvanized metal causes evolution of zinc oxide fumes that, when inhaled, provoke an influenza-like syndrome with headaches, nausea, weakness, myalgia, coughing, dyspnea, and fever. Diempsia refers to breathing difficulties. It is clear that many factors can produce severe illness and symptoms that may have been attributed to influenza. As part of the recognition of the centennial anniversary of World War I, the Imperial War Museum in England produced a website containing material about the conflict, including a number of audio tapes made by survivors of the war who talk about their experiences, in particular trench warfare. The war veterans talk about the atrocious conditions they had to endure. They were often up to their stomachs in water, and their dugouts were just mud and filth. They report freezing winter weather. Their wet boots froze overnight on their feet, leading to numbness. This is referred to as trench foot. Their diets were said to include little meat, bread, chocolate, and most of them smoked. Their poor sanitary and hygiene conditions have prevailed for the last few centuries in modern cities. The audio recordings also mention the women working at home to support the war effort by filing shells with cordite, or the black powder as they called it. They also worked with hazardous substances like TNT. Eleanor McBean, whose book was referenced earlier in the video, who was a child during the epidemic, assisted her parents to care for the sick, reported that she failed to become ill despite her close proximity to many people with the allegedly infectious disease. In conclusion, to me it is abundantly obvious that there was no epidemic disease, and that the stress of war and combat, multiple toxic vaccinations, the use of toxic medication, the appalling conditions in which soldiers lived and fought, the exposure to deadly toxic gas and other toxic materials provide ample evidence to adequately explain the epidemic of illness and the devastating loss of life. I would, however, like to finish off with something to add to the list of stresses on the bodies of the humans at the time: electromagnetic radiation. I'm now going to read an extract from the book The Invisible Rainbow, A History of Electricity and Life by Arthur Fussenberg, which I have yet to read fully. In 1904, bees began to die on the Isle of Wight following the installation of radio transmitters by Marconi. These transmitters work at frequencies close to megahertz levels. On the other side of the channel, Jacques Arès d'Ozovan showed that sharp and hooked electromagnetic signals are far more toxic than sinusoidal signals. The truth was that after a year and a half experimenting with radio transmitters in full health at the age of 22, Marconi began to develop fevers. These attacks continued for the rest of his life. In 1904, while working on setting up a transmitter powerful enough for transatlantic communications, these fevers became so intense they were thought to be malaria. In 1905, he married Patrice O'Brien, and after their honeymoon they settled on the island close to a transmitter. As soon as Patrice had settled in, she began to complain of tetanus. After 3 months, she fell ill with severe jaundice. She had to return to London to give birth to a baby, who only lived for a few weeks and died of unknown causes. During the same period, Macroni spent several months suffering from fever and delirium. Between 1918 and 1921, he suffered suicidal depression while working on a shortwave transmitter. In 1927, while on his honeymoon from his second marriage, he collapsed with chest pain and was diagnosed with serious cardiac disorders. Between 1934 and 1937, while he was developing microwave technology, he had 9 heart attacks, the final one killing him at the age of 63. On the same island at Aldbourne House, Queen Victoria suffered cerebral hemorrhages and died on the evening of January 22, 1901, just as Macroni was putting a new transmitter in operation less than 13 miles away. In 1901 there were only 2 transmitters, while in 1904 there were 4, making this island the most irradiated place on the planet, leaving bees no room for survival. In 1906 a survey revealed that 90% of the bees had completely disappeared for no apparent reason. New colonies were brought to the island, but these likewise died within a week. This new epidemic spread across England and then across the Western world, and then gradually stabilized until the armies equipped themselves with various high-powered radio transmitters towards the end of the First World War, triggering, as we have seen, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, which actually began in the United States at the Naval Radio School of Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 400 initial cases. This epidemic rapidly spread to 1,127 soldiers at Funston Camp, Kansas, where wireless connections had been installed. What intrigued the doctors was that while 15% of the civilian population was suffering from nosebleeds, 40% of the Navy suffered from them. Other bleeding also occurred, and a third of those who died so due to internal hemorrhaging of the lungs or brain. In fact, it was the composition of the blood that had been altered, as the measured coagulation time was more than twice as long as normal. These symptoms are incompatible with the effects of the influenza respiratory viruses, but totally consistent with the devastating effects of electricity. Another incongruity was that 2/3 of the victims were healthy young people. A further atypical flu symptom was that the pulse slowed to rates of between 36 and 48, whereas this is a common result of exposure to electromagnetic fields. In addition, it was possible to successfully treat some sufferers with massive dosages of calcium. The military physician Dr. George A. Soper testified that the virus was spreading faster than the speed of movement of people. Various experiments were conducted attempting to infect subjects either by direct close contact or by inoculation with mucus or blood, but the experiments were unable to demonstrate any infection by this means. It can be seen that new influenza pandemic corresponds to a new advance in electrical technology, such as the Asian flu of 1957-58, following the installation of a powerful radar surveillance system, and the outbreak of Hong Kong flu from July 1968 onwards, following the commissioning of the 28 military satellites for space surveillance at the altitude of the Van Allen belts, which protect us from cosmic radiation. My final thoughts are that a virus is not being made by electromagnetic radiation, but electromagnetic radiation is damaging to all life forms on this planet, and so the symptoms of COVID-19 are similar and sometimes the same as a radiation poisoning. And with the installation of new 5G technology in the future months and years to come, I predict there'll be a great loss of life. I really hope that electromagnetic radiation is just a conspiracy theory, as many online and in public will say. But if the research I am reading is correct, then when 5G has been fully installed across the globe, millions, possibly billions of people could die. If there is a second wave of COVID-19, it will be more than likely not be COVID-19, but something much more sinister. Thank you for watching. I have left a link to all sources and references in the description and in the order of which they were referenced in the video.